Well, I wish to start by thanking Christian Solidarity International and everyone who made this event possible and who invited me here. In particular, Dr. John Eibner, and to hold it in this lovely Swiss city of Zurich, the first time I come here, to address you all this evening. My stay here, except for the rain, has so far been wonderful in every way. We're not used to rain in June in Lebanon. But thanks, John, for everything. Well, it is obvious that for decades, since the middle years of the last century, the persistent plague afflicting the Middle East region as a whole has consisted of these repressive dictatorial regimes and these despots, with their tight strangleholds on a number of countries and their societies and peoples. And now they have been collapsing one after the other for over a year. Clearly, no one with a modicum of moral sensibility could condone what these regimes have done to their peoples, or how some, like the Assad regime in Damascus, continue to massacre the innocents. I come from Lebanon, where few have forgotten the misery inflicted on the Lebanese by Syria's nearly 3-decade-long occupation of their country. Hence, it is understandable that the initial euphoria when the Arab uprisings occurred in a number of countries would lead enthusiasts to call the phenomenon the Arab Spring. Such high hopes were pinned on these revolutions, ushering in a new and bright era of freedoms, rights, and participatory politics for the Arab region. Now, 1.5 years later, what remains of the anticipated spring is a jumble of disturbing outcomes and ominous tendencies that resemble anything but a democratic spring. The two overriding questions today are, first, what will replace these repressive regimes? And second, at what cost to their peoples and to the region as a whole will their elimination come? I pose these two questions and I'll get back to them in a while. If in the early days the hype in the Western media that quickly infected the Arab media spoke of the Facebook generation of Arab youth, the power of social media to bring swift political transformation to Arab societies, the, quote, voice of Arab liberals, end quote, finally making itself heard, and other similar exclamations. What has transpired on the ground, however, is something very different. Facebook and the social media had the ephemeral impact of igniting the protests, but nothing close to serious and sustained political organization and institutionalization to see them through to concrete and lasting gains. Networking is not the same as organization building. And the voice of the Arab liberals soon gave way to chants of Allahu Akbar. Effectively, the revolutions were either stunted or hijacked by the better organized and better funded illiberal forces of Islamism, thereby plunging the region into an uncertain future fraught with perils. Most vulnerable throughout the Middle East are the native Muslim and non-Muslim, specifically Christian, minority communities. Also vulnerable are many Muslims, especially women, who do not wish to live under strict versions of Sharia or Islamic law. But this is precisely where the region is headed if present trends continue. Women, for example, will have it especially hard. Women have to cover up because their nakedness invites abuse, a classic example of blaming the victim. And the open approval of honor killings, if you add that to this notion of covering up, a grotesquely savage new reality will have set in. The ouster of Ben Ali in Tunisia did eventually bring in Marzouki, a moderate, as leader. But the Islamists have been strengthened, and their ongoing challenge is by no means a settled matter. Shortly after Gaddafi's death in Libya, Mustafa Abdel Jalil, the then head of the National Transitional Council, declared that henceforth polygamy would be accepted on a wide scale and the country would be ruled under Sharia. It took a subsequent uproar, mainly from abroad, for him to backtrack from his Islamist Freudian slip. But Libya is still far from being on the road to democracy. And Egypt, after a year and a half of the revolution that ousted Mubarak, has produced 2 presidential candidates for the runoff elections, neither of them a liberal. Ahmed Shafiq of the old regime, Mubarak's last prime minister, and Mohammad Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood. We cannot but repeat Francis Fukuyama's recent frustrated exclamation in Newsweek, and I quote, "How did we come to this pass, where the 2 most powerful forces in the new Egypt either represent its authoritarian past or else are Islamists of suspect liberal credentials," end quote. Can anyone therefore blame the Copts, Egypt's about 8 or so million Christians? Can anyone blame them of exaggerated or even unfounded fears, when we all know full well what sort of recurring bloody attacks their community has suffered at the hands of both politically ascendant groups in Egypt today? The disconnect between the optimistic Western rhetoric of a new democratic dawn for the Arab East and the depressing realities on the ground is only surpassed in its absurdity by the regional allies the West has chosen to spearhead this movement of liberation from the tyranny of the Arab despots. These regional allies, of course, being Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Nothing highlights this bizarre situation more than what is going on in Syria. Are we to believe then that fanatic states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, enjoying unwavering Western backing, are actually championing a liberal alternative to the Assad dictatorship in Syria? Rhetorical question. Rhetorical answer, of course not. They are financing and supporting a militant Sunni Salafi Wahhabi replacement there, and indeed anywhere else in the region they can manage it. Grasping this single stark fact will allow so many pieces of both the Syrian and the wider regional puzzle to fall in place. For one thing, it exposes the short-sighted policies of the Western powers. It also explains the deep ambivalence Syria's Christians and other targeted minorities there and in neighboring countries feel with regard to regime change in Damascus. Their tragic choices, these minorities, have sadly been of what I would call the frying pan to the fire variety. That is, between bad or worse. They are not, these minorities, these vulnerable minorities, ambivalent about regime change, they are not blind supporters of the bloody regimes, nor are they gratuitous Islamophobes, as they have been unjustly accused. Moreover, Saudi-Qatari promotion of Sunni militancy shatters the illusion nurtured by a beguiled Western media that the Syrian opposition to Assad's brutal rule is merely benign and moderate Sunni Islam. The first wave of opposition leaders who ignited the anti-regime protests 18 months ago have nearly all vanished and given way to the so-called Free Syrian Army, a militant Islamist grouping with long beards that practices on a regular basis kidnappings, beheadings, and incessantly chants Allahu Akbar, Al-Qaeda style, when it films military attacks against regime forces. There is basically no difference between the Syrian regime kidnapping people in Lebanon during that country's 1975 to 1990 war for political reasons, and the Syrian opposition today kidnapping Lebanese most recently 11 Shiite pilgrims returning from Iran, were abducted inside Syria just on the next to the Turkish border 2 weeks ago, and they're still missing for sectarian reasons. I don't see the difference between these two types of abductions. They are two faces, if you will, of the same ugly coin. There is plenty to worry about if the Syrian opposition now starts to kidnap religious pilgrims. Once in power, how will this opposition treat minorities? Given these disturbing spectacles, how can anyone take seriously the reassurances to Christians, Alawis, and other minorities in Syria issued the day before yesterday by Abdel Basit Sida, the new president of the Syrian National Council, that they will be well treated and allowed to participate in politics once the Assad regime is gone? To their credit, some weeks earlier, American officials like Hillary Clinton, Leon Panetta, and General Dempsey expressed doubts about the immunity of the Syrian opposition to Salafi infiltration. And they showed a prudent reluctance to support an all-out arming of this suspect opposition. And lastly, Saudi-Qatari stoking of the fires of Sunni extremism in Syria and elsewhere justifies the apprehensions of many nations, including Russia and China, that what is about to follow Assad is a far worse scenario, not only for Syria, but for the entire Middle East. So now, returning to the two questions I posed earlier, we can see some perhaps unsettling answers before us. First question, what is likely to replace the repressive and faltering Assad regime in Syria, the fallen Mubarak regime in Egypt, and other similar dictatorships throughout the region? Most likely, if present trends continue, the better funded, better motivated, and better organized Islamists of these various countries. And the second question, at what price will the change of dictatorships come? Well, if Kofi Annan's recent warning is true, and sadly I believe it is, Syria, unlike Libya, will not implode, but will rather explode with catastrophic consequences for the entire region. The outcome will either be bloody, open-ended chaos, featuring Sunni Shiite carnage, with Christians and other minorities trampled underfoot, or the emergence of a far worse dictatorship of the Salafi, jihadi, takfiri variety, what some sources have termed Islamofascism. My main concern when it comes to the Arab Spring generally and the Syrian situation specifically is the adverse impact all of this will have on native minority communities, especially the Christians. This is not to suggest that these communities are somehow the only ones suffering, but they, more than all others, are in danger of being overlooked, bypassed, and ignored until it is too late. Christian suffering has a way of being chronically underreported. And when finally it receives attention, the damage is already done. And there's very little follow-up, usually after the reporting, the meager reporting. Without these Christian communities, pluralism is all but dead in the Middle East, and along with it, any real chances for genuine freedoms and democracy. Indigenous Middle Eastern Christians, whether in Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, among the Palestinians, and whatever remains of them in Iraq, do not see a spring anywhere in sight. To them, the term Arab Spring sounds increasingly like a bad joke. Actually, it's a form of black humor. They see instead the makings of an Arab nightmare, and one with the possibility of bringing death and destruction to them and to peoples and cultures far beyond the Middle East. Historically, Christians did not participate in the creation of these repressive regimes, except individually and intellectually for certain specific Greek Orthodox theoreticians of Ba'athism and Arabism. I write about this in my little book. On the other hand, Christians did help to usher in modernity to the Arab region during the Arab cultural renaissance, beginning in the late 19th century and ever since. They also led in the defense of the great Arab national causes, including that of Palestine. Christians therefore don't need a certificate of good behavior, a seal of approval from anyone. Today, these same Christians of the Arab world are basically afraid of the unknown, the absence of any Arab model for democracy. Their region is historically freedom-starved. The vast majority of them have lived for centuries as dhimmis, that is, second-class subjugated individuals and communities, deprived of basic freedoms, under mainly Sunni rule. Islamism is everywhere on the rise. There is no real pluralism or acceptance of minorities, and there is no reliable roadmap to guide this transition to democracy, and no one is available to offer them any reassurance. Not Muslim moderates. They have actually, these communities, especially the Christians, have little confidence in the ability of Sunni moderation specifically to stand on its own feet. Not the West, and not Russia, although this latter has been vocal about its concern for their plight in the words and regional visits of Moscow Patriarch Kirill. Add to all this that native Christians suffer chronic demographic shrinkage and mounting emigration. Witness the battering endured by Lebanon's Christians since 1975, the decimation of Iraq's Christians since 2003, the continuing harassment of Egypt's Copts, and now the fears of Syria's Christian communities. Since the 1930s, Sunnis in both Lebanon and Syria have sporadically called for unity among Sunnis in the two countries. Christians are not enamored by adventurism, nor do they support the repressive regimes. Their aims are modest: not to have their churches and communities targeted in Iraq and Egypt, to try and retain even a token presence in the Holy Land, to enjoy equality and freedom in a pluralist system, not to be singled out as scapegoats or revenge objects in the mayhem in Syria, and not to revisit any of Lebanon's recent sectarian and religious horrors. It is not their specialty, that is the Christians, to address the crucial question now being historically posed, namely the place of political Islam in the running of the Arab state and the prosecution of political power. This is the question now posed historically. What will the place of religion, specifically Islam, be in the new emerging Arab state order? It's not the Christians who should give answers to this. What Christians want for themselves, they also want for their fellow Muslims and for the other minorities: freedom, mutual respect, and no maltreatment. How this question of the place of Islam in the new emerging Arab state order will be addressed will affect profoundly the future of all minority communities native to the region, the Christians included. The endemic weakness of liberalism in an Arab and predominantly Islamic context is the underlying issue of concern for all. As I hinted earlier, Sunni moderation has revealed itself to be weak, short-lived, disorganized, and easily cowed or intimidated into silence or submission. I'm not denying there are Sunni moderates. Of course there are Sunni moderates. Probably the vast majority of them are just ordinary people who want to get by their day and basically live and let live. The problem is that it takes only a handful of violent extremists to intimidate everyone. That is the issue. Lurking here for the Christians and the other minorities, Alawis, Druze, Kurds, I mean the Kurds are Sunnis, but they are not Arabs, so they're an ethnic minority, etc. Lurking here for the Christians and these groups are fears of the slippery slope, the gradual slide, incremental, towards greater and more violent Islamist extremism. Now, these fears should not be made light of. These fears are not hallucinations born of a fertile imagination. And they are not, as some have claimed, the result of a trap, the sectarian bogeyman set by the Assad regime, even though such regimes do cynically exploit sectarianism for their purposes. Of course they do. But these regimes did not fabricate sectarianism. It exists as an independent reality throughout the region, always has. There is a spurious argument out there, currently popular, mainly in American think tank policy circles. It goes something like this. As a matter of principle, we are obliged to support the ouster of repressive dictatorships. Fine. And since we can't always control who or what replaces them, despite all the rhetoric of democracy, freedom, and human rights, we will deal with the replacement later on the basis of our same principles if this replacement turns out to be as bad or even worse than the toppled tyrants. Well, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, but this line of reasoning is disingenuous and hypocritical. Where were these voices when US policy was centered on propping up these now hateful regimes? The argument is also fundamentally immoral and irresponsible. Looking the other way as Islamists come to power, not to mention aiding and abetting them to reach their objective, is to know that a worse situation is developing, but to ignore this and not to actively try and preempt it. One sure casualty of this form of irresponsible neglect, if not of callous experimentation, which is a favorite pastime of some of these think tank analysts, experimentation. We're not very interested in being their guinea pigs. One sure casualty of this form of irresponsible neglect, if not of callous experimentation, is surely the vulnerable minorities and moderates who are all but designated beforehand as expendable or as affordable collateral damage. Instead of doing everything to try and strengthen the admittedly weak forces of moderation within any opposition movement, we witness a resigned and lazy attitude that readily accepts the Islamists assuming power and postpones dealing with the assured adverse consequences of this outcome until it is too late, especially for minorities in the firing line. Nurturing Salafism, by default or by design, is the Frankenstein in US Middle East policy today. Didn't we see this before in Afghanistan in the 1980s, when US support for the Mujahideen in their fight against Soviet communism created bin Laden? Given this complicated and potentially explosive picture, what can well-meaning and influential people like yourselves, as well as the representatives of concerned governments, what can they do to try and soften the adverse, even disastrous, possible turn of events? Four main things come to mind, and with these I will end my talk. The first, aim and work for a comprehensive deal over both Syria and Iran with Russia. If matters can wait until after the American presidential elections, this should be the new president's top priority. Russia has signaled it is ready for such a deal, while vehemently opposing any military interventions or serious arming of the Syrian opposition. The Russians have said that, a settlement could involve Assad's departure. That's a good opening move, if you will, towards a deal. Russia also has important interests in Syria. They have the Tartus port, which is a naval facility for them, and I think they might have use of another smaller one in Algeria, but that's it for them in the Mediterranean. The rest of the Mediterranean is an American lake, basically. So, they have concerns clearly there. They have legitimate fears of the rise of Sunni militancy. If you try to view the world from Moscow, you see that there are the Chechens right there, supported by Saudi money. The United States refuses to call these outrages perpetrated by the Chechens terrorism. The Russians also see the United States trying to cut a deal with the Taliban to quit Afghanistan. They see the rise of Islamism throughout these various Arab states I mentioned. So they will never let go of Iran and Syria that easily. Russia also may not be a match for the United States in terms of superpower status, but Russia still possesses vast disruptive capabilities. And so in a multilateral world, it makes every sense to sit and talk with the Russians. Israel's fixation on Iran's nuclear program risks igniting the entire region and dragging the US into an unnecessary and calamitous conflagration. This also deflects attention from the real dangers besetting the region, namely a creeping advance to power of Wahhabi-inspired radical Sunni Salafists, who in the long run will prove far more dangerous and destructive to Israel and the West and the entire Middle East than anything Iran can muster. A deal over Iran could involve, this is now me speculating, if you will, but a deal over Iran could involve accepting that Tehran reach the brink of nuclear breakout, short of actually manufacturing anything, with very intrusive monitoring by the IAEA, full transparency, in return for three things. One, renouncing all of this unnecessary and highly inflammatory anti-Israel rhetoric. Two, curbing Hezbollah, Syria, if the regime survives, and other regional allies of Iran. And three, serving as a kind of counterbalance to Saudi Arabia and militant Wahhabism. In other words, acting like a responsible force for regional and Gulf stability. I may be dreaming, but I still feel that we haven't crossed the 11th hour. Once, if the region doesn't blow up between now and November and a new president comes, that should be top priority for the president to talk with Mr. Putin. So that's number one. Number two, I said I have four things. Number two, the US and the European community must actively pressure both Saudi Arabia and Qatar to temper Sunni agitation and stop fanning the flames of Sunni fanaticism with money, arms, and propaganda. Blowing up the entire region is not the way to change a dictator in Syria or elsewhere. The charade of arch repressors, namely Saudi Arabia and Qatar, leading a crusade versus regional dictators with American and Western backing has to end. At the risk of sounding reductionist, I maintain that Saudi Arabia produces a great deal of the toxicity in the region and beyond. But the problem is also that Saudi Arabia happens to be the West's gas station. So really, I conclude from this that the greatest challenge facing world statesmanship at present is how to decouple Wahhabism and the Al Saud dynasty on the one hand from the oil and the vast amounts of petrodollars generated. But that's for another day. The third point I wish to end with is this. The US and its Western allies, induced by pressure from grassroots organizations, must draw a thick red line to protect and preserve whatever meager freedoms already exist in parts of the Middle East and build upon them. Freedom is a very rare and fragile commodity, especially in a place like the Middle East. So if you happen to stumble on it, it should be preserved. This means, among other things, active protection for minority rights and for pluralism as absolutely integral components of any meaningful move towards democratization. What needs to be done is to fight this one man, one vote, one time specter that Salafists want, and that is a mortal threat to democracy. Raw majority rule in an Islamic environment can lead to what Alexis de Tocqueville termed the tyranny of the majority. So you always have to emphasize not just the formal aspects of democracy, campaigns, elections, majority rule, but the substantive value features of democracy, minority rights, respect for the rule of law, pluralism, etc. They're not emphasized enough when the discourse of democracy is addressed to an Islamic context. If freedom is indeed what the West truly wishes for the peoples and societies of the Middle East, then wherever this rare and precious human commodity exists in the region, and Lebanon is a good example where freedom continues to exist despite the battering the country has endured since 1975. That freedom must be protected and defended at all costs. As a little aside on Lebanon, the Christian community there, despite its divisions and lousy leadership, I would say, remains the freest in the region. And because of this, Lebanon itself is freer than all other Arab societies. Lebanon has no dictator, and its ex-presidents and prime ministers are alive and usually thrive outside office until they die of natural causes. The Ta'if Agreement, which ended the war in 1989-90, that agreement does need to be revisited and modified, but not at the price of another war. I mean, if it's going to involve another war, the Lebanese are not interested. We'll live with the Ta'if Agreement with its defects, and it has many. Hezbollah's weapons can and should be regulated through internal agreement, not external pressures or attacks. If the region-wide Sunni Shiite showdown is all but unavoidable, the West should exercise diligent damage control, in particular collateral damage inflicted on exposed minorities such as the Christians, where freedoms tend to reside, and whatever moderate Muslims may end up in the line of fire as well. Only the survival of such moderation and religious pluralism can offer the region some hope of a better tomorrow, once the dust of intersectarian confrontation between Shiites and Sunnis settles. If indeed we are witnessing the region devolving, if you will, into its primordial ethno-religious aggregates after, the artificial cobbling together during the Sykes-Picot era of these various nations, if now we're seeing a kind of renewed fragmentation of all that, then the protection I'm calling for may actually entail devising creative federal arrangements for beleaguered communities. But I just throw this out as an idea which would require considerable discussion and thought. Lebanon's unique share of this rare commodity of freedom means it must be insulated as much as possible from importations of the sectarian tensions plaguing Syria and the region. And lastly, my fourth point is a word to Europe. What you have heard from me here today is a cry for understanding and help, a cry on behalf of millions of native Arab Christians and others like them who feel exposed and endangered by the uncertainties of what is transpiring all around them. But this also has been a cry of warning for you right here in Europe. If Islamism is allowed to hijack the Arab uprisings while you are asleep or looking the other way, or in some cases, Bernard-Henri Lévy comes to mind, working feverishly to make this happen, then you will be adversely affected right here in your own homes. First of all, Muslim immigration into Europe will skyrocket as soon as people, Muslims, realize they can't live under Sharia, as the radical Islamists at the end of the slippery slope will surely want to impose. Second, if they are true to their ideology, these militant Salafis will, if anything, wish to carry their ideological confrontation with the West a step further toward active jihad. You will then have terrorism like nothing you have seen so far. So, allowing an Islamist hijacking of the Arab uprisings will result in Islamic immigration and Islamist terrorism for you right here. Just be warned that doing all you can to spare the Middle East a slide towards Islamism would be protecting yourselves in the final analysis. And I will stop here. Thank you.